The comparison in this video isn't actually fair because these GPUs don't cost the same. However, I did poll my audience on which comparisons they wanted to see the most with the RTX 4060 beyond my launch review. Now, my launch review was looking at cards that cost the same. The RTX 4060 versus the 6700 XT versus the RTX 3060 12GB, which are all around $300. And in this video, I saw the 6700 XT from AMD consistently ahead, almost never beaten, a few occasional rough ties, and only in the heaviest of ray tracing workloads did the 6700 XT fall behind. And it was available at, let's see, the 6700 XT was available at, and still is, it looks like right now, brand new for $310. And the RTX 4060 costs $300 and is sitting in stock, widely available within the launch window here, showing what people think I think of this card at $300. So the point is, the nearest price competitor AMD has in the current market is the 6700 XT, and I already gave that my recommendation over the 4060. However, that is a last generation discounted product, so it's likely not going to be available forever. Also, by naming scheme, 7600 and 4060 sound like direct competitors from the current generation, and like I said, other than doing the 1060, 2060, 3060, 4060 video, which I already released, the people next place seem to be interested in 4060 versus 7600. But I want to be clear that right now, the 7600 has been available already, despite it being very close to its launch, as low as $250. If I wanted to buy one right now, let's check what the in-stock prices are. It looks like about $258 for the cheapest models on a 7600. So basically, the market has already decided the value of the 7600 needed to come down. So versus lowest prices that have been available recently, the 4060 costs 20% more than a 7600, which is a significant difference. And if I do it against the prices I'm available for, like right now, it's about a 16% price increase over the 7600. So when we look at the comparisons here, we need to be careful to think about, okay, the 4060 does cost more. It should be better. The question is, how much better? Is it actually better, right? In other words, I'll give you some final thoughts at the end where we analyze the price difference. Also, the specific models I'm looking at here is the reference model from AMD on their RX 7600. And NVIDIA does not seem to have a Founders Edition of the 4060, so they sent me the Asus Dual OC Edition, and I'm running them both at their out-of-the-box settings. I am enabling Smart Access Memory and ResizeBAR, as that is on by default on my 7800X3D testing system. Anyway, so with it out of the way that these are not actually direct price competitors, let's go ahead and look at the benchmarks, and I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. Let's start with some current console generation exclusives like Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and here we're looking at 1080p epic settings. This game is pushing the popular Unreal Engine 4 to its limits. We'll also be looking at a little bit of Unreal Engine 5 here in a minute. But in this game, we're seeing the RX 7600, good for over 60 FPS through this benchmark run, and the RTX 4060 ahead by 9%. We see, you can look at the watt reported up at the top and see that the RTX 4060 is delivering a little bit faster performance for less power consumption, which is certainly one of its strongest points, is the energy efficiency. And another advantage over the AMD GPU is ray tracing performance. So if we enable ray tracing on the EPIC settings here, we now see the RX 7600 dropping kind of into the mid-40s, whereas the RTX 4060 still hangs out very close to 60 FPS, giving it a 33% lead over the 7600 and actually a 56% lead in the 1% lows. This frame time graph certainly looks a lot more spiky on the 7600. Now, I'm also noticing the system RAM usage a lot higher on the 7600, so I'm wondering if it's VRAM, well, they're both 8GB cards, I wonder if the VRAM is handled a little more gracefully on the 4060, just a suspicion. Anyway, if we go up to 1440p epic settings, neither card is really knocking it out of the park here. With the RX 7600, in the mid 30s a lot of the time, might get up to 40-ish by the end of the benchmark run. And the RTX 4060, a few frames per second better than that, giving it a 10% lead in the average FPS and a 9% in the 1% lows. But still not really knocking it out of the park, although this is the kind of game you'd play on a controller, and this would certainly feel fine on a controller, in my opinion, but you'd probably want to turn some settings down. But we're not going to do that. We're going to turn settings up to kick on some ray tracing, just compare their relative ray tracing performance here at 1440p epic. And here we're seeing the RTX 4060 winning by 28% in the averages and 79% in the 1% lows. The RX 7600 is giving us around 30 FPS. We're in the low 30s, whereas the RTX 4060 is more like in the upper 30s. And again, probably not the settings you'd really be wanting to play on either of these. However, I think 40 FPS really does feel a lot better than 30 FPS from a responsiveness standpoint. So definitely an advantage here if you were going to play at these settings. Let's move over to Unreal Engine 5. And Layers of the Fear is the first full third-party released Unreal Engine 5 game, and it uses the Lumen lighting system, but does not use the nanite system and isn't as super demanding as I'm sure we'll see. Here, the RTX 4060 is 12% faster on average, 11% in the 1% lows, but it's 85 FPS versus about 95 FPS, so they're both doing very well here. Again, this game's not super demanding. If we kick on hardware accelerated ray tracing, which hardware accelerates the Lumen lighting system here, it's not incredibly demanding, and the 4060 is now 18% faster on the averages and 24% faster in the 1% lows. But again, a smaller lead in ray tracing than what we saw in Jedi Survivor. If we move up to 1440p high settings, they're both dropping below 60 FPS. The RX 7600, kind of in the low 50s, the 4060 closer to the upper 50s. In the easier scenes here, it can get over 60 FPS. It's an 11% lead on average for the 4060 and a 9% in the 1% lows. And again, we can kick on the hardware accelerated Lumen ray tracing. And that now pushes the 4060 to a 21% lead in the averages and a 26% in the 1% lows. And, on a variable refresh rate display, the frame rates here are perfectly usable, especially in a slow-paced game like this, with the 4060 a little shy of 60 FPS and the 7600 down in the upper 40s. Let's move on to A Plague Tale Requiem at 1080p Ultra settings. And here we're seeing basically a tie. Technically, the RTX 4060 is ahead by 2% here, but that's literally like a 1 FPS difference, and they're tied in the 1% lows. This game looks excellent, uses Asobo Studios' own in-house engine, is also not super VRAM hungry, unlike what we see in a lot of recent games. And if we move up to 1440p Ultra, we now see them exactly tied. They have the same average FPS and the same 1% lows, although that actual frame rate running through this intro cutscene as my benchmark run puts their averages kind of in the low-mid 40s, whereas the more demanding scenes will dip into the 30s. Also, this game does feature frame generation, which you could enable on the RTX 4060, and I do like it in this game. Now let's go ahead and move on to The Last of Us Part 1. And this is on patch 1.1. The game has gotten patched significantly since launch. It's in a lot better state. At 1080p Ultra settings, though, it does try to use more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And it looks like the RTX 4060 is handling this game a lot better than the RX 7600. The 4060 is 38% ahead on the averages and 40% in the 1% lows. The 7600 is perfectly playable in the mid-50 FPS range, and the RTX 4060 is in the mid-70s. However, if we drop down to the high settings, now the RTX 4060 is only up by 18% and 15% in the 1% lows. I really feel like this points to, despite, again, these both being 8 gigabyte VRAM cards, perhaps NVIDIA handling VRAM a little bit better. Maybe it doesn't spill over quite as badly, or when it does go over its VRAM capacity, it doesn't get hit as hard, because again, going down to the high settings, seems to bring these cards a lot closer together. So it's at least my suspicion, because I know at the ultra settings it does spill over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. If we go up to 1440p at the high preset, both cards can still deliver a good experience here, and the RTX 4060 is 11% ahead of the 7600 and 12% in the 1% lows, with the 7600 offering us kind of a mid-50s sort of an experience, and the RTX 4060 hanging out closer to 60 FPS. Again, though, both GPUs giving a good experience at 1440p high settings, although if you go ahead and enable the ultra settings, it does use a lot more VRAM, and that hurts both cards significantly, although once again it seems like the 4060 has its lead grow when that happens. It's now 20% ahead on average FPS compared to the 7600, and 32% ahead in the 1% lows. The 4060 is kind of hanging out in the low 40s. Again, you could play it that way. I think the high settings offered a much better experience, and the 7600 is down in the mid-30s. At launch, the high textures didn't look great in this game, but they have been patched a lot since then and do a lot better. Now, let's move on to another PlayStation 5 exclusive that's been ported to PC with Returnal. At 1080p Epic preset, the 4060 is only 6% ahead of the 7600, and 17% ahead in the 1% lows, but they're both giving really an excellent experience here. The RX 7600 is averaging in the upper 70s through the benchmark run, and the RTX 4060 is in the low 80s. This game does not push beyond 8 gigabytes of VRAM, which is significant to note. And at the 1440p Epic settings, it's still behaving well for VRAM capacity, and the RTX 4060 is averaging right around 60 FPS, with the 7600 close behind in the mid-50s, with a 9% lead overall for the RTX 4060 and a 14% lead in the 1% lows. So still pretty playable around 60 FPS on these GPUs. And the last PlayStation 5 exclusive I'm going to look at here that's been ported to PC is Forspoken, which I do test at its maximum settings, the ultra high preset, which does include ray tracing. And at these settings, the 4060 has a 25% lead, although it's still falling short of 60 FPS itself, closer to 50, with the 7600 closer to 40 FPS. Again, this includes ray tracing, and it does use a lot of VRAM in this game as well. At 1440p ultra settings, the 7600 dips into unplayable frame rates a lot of the time, although in some scenes it does better. The average is ending up well below 30 FPS, and the RTX 4060 is only in the mid-30s on its averages. Again, I think it's being held back significantly by VRAM capacity, but it does give the 4060 a 40% lead over the 7600 in this test. Again, this test does include ray tracing. Another game that includes ray tracing at its max preset is Resident Evil 4. We're moving into some cross-generation titles here. And this game at its max settings does use a lot of VRAM, which can cause the 1% lows to be terrible on both, but by the end of the benchmark run, the 4060 has recovered a bit better than the 7600 has. So their average FPS is about the same in the mid-50s, whereas the 1% lows came out ahead on the 4060, although both could stutter. Now, if you go down to the prioritize graphics preset, and some of my GPUs were enabling FSR2 quality on this preset, and some weren't, so I went ahead and just turned on FSR2 quality. So this does have upscaling. They both have really high frame rates at these settings, with the 4060 ahead by 13% in both the averages and the 1% lows. But the 7600 is still close to 120 frames per second. It's just the 4060 is 13% ahead of that, up in the mid-130s. Now, if we go up to 1440p at the maximum preset, once again, this includes ray tracing and uses a lot of VRAM. Both GPUs can stutter. Both of them can have their 1% lows dip significantly, but once again, by the end of the particular section that I'm benchmarking, the 4060 has its 1% lows recover a little bit smoother, and it ends up significantly ahead in the 1% lows, but on average, they're both hanging out right around 40 frames per second, so probably not the settings you would use anyway. If you go down to the prioritize graphics preset, which does not include ray tracing, and once again, I did have FSR2 quality enabled on this, We now see the 4060 ahead by 9% on the averages and 7% in the 1% lows, but both GPUs giving a very good experience, with the 7600 averaging in the mid-80s and the RTX 4060 averaging in the mid-90s. So both of them have a lot of headroom there, even to also turn off the upscaling. You probably didn't really need it. It was just on, like I said, for some of my GPUs. Now let's move over to Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 at 1080p balanced, where we now see the RX 7600 taking a pretty noticeable lead, with by 18% on the averages and 17% in the 1% lows. That is fairly typical for this game. It does seem to favor AMD hardware. Both GPUs giving a very good experience here, 170-ish FPS on the 7600 and a little over 140 on the 4060. Even moving up to 1440p and staying at the balanced preset, not the extreme, because I think this is more like how people would actually use these GPUs. We see the 7600 ahead by 18% on the averages and 21% in the 1% lows, looking at about 118 FPS versus 100 FPS. By the end of the benchmark run. So again, very, very playable and good frame rates on both of them. And again, just 7600 definitely pulling a win in this game. Now, if we jump over to Cyberpunk 2077, 1080p ultra settings, we once again see the 7600 pulling a win, but it's a small one, so I'd really call this more of a tie. You'd have trouble knowing which GPU you were using, most likely, if you were just playing the game on a blind test. It's a 4% lead for the on the averages, and a 7% lead in the 1% lows, which is at least a little bit more significant there on the frame time graph. Now, both of them, over 80 FPS, so good experience there at 1080p Ultra. If we go up to 1440p Ultra, the 7600 actually pulls a little bit further ahead. This one might be a bit more noticeable. 8% lead on the averages and 13% in the 1% lows. So kind of a, lower mid-50s result on the 7600 versus right around 49 or 50 FPS on the 4060. And again, there are scenes in this game that can certainly tank the frame rate. Or you could tank your frame rate, you could improve your frame rate by enabling upscaling, so we will take a look at that. With DLSS and FSR2 at the quality setting, the 7600 is now ahead by 14% on averages and 15% in the 1% lows, averaging in the mid-60s, with the RTX 4060 still hanging out just a bit below 60 FPS, even with DLSS quality upscaling. Although I will say that the DLSS upscaling, in my opinion, does look better in motion, although both are usable at 1440p. And now, if we enable heavy ray tracing, the RTX 4060 takes a significant lead, although I call this a Pyrrhic victory or sometimes a murder-suicide, in that the 7600 is down in the teens. The RTX 4060 doubles that frame rate in the averages and the 1% lows, but that only gets it a little bit over 30 FPS, which I just don't think most people would choose to play this game at 30 frames per second at 1080p RT Ultra. If you were going to use ray tracing that heavily, you would want to use upscaling. So here we can take another look at that. FSR2 quality versus DLSS quality versus DLSS quality plus frame generation. You can see some stutters on the frame gen graph right now. I'm wondering if that's VRAM related, because it does add a bit of VRAM, and so does ray tracing. You can also take a look at the PC latency down at the very bottom, where you can see frame generation does also increase the PC latency a bit, and you can get some image quality artifacts. That being said, it does get you a smoothed out motion image on your monitor, and you might be there are definitely games where I think a lot of people would choose to enable that. And again, I'd rather not upscale at 1080p at all. I don't think it looks good. But if you were going to use it, I do think that the DLSS quality image is looking better than the FSR2 quality image. And then with the ray tracing enabled, again, you are getting now playable frame rates. So with heavy ray tracing, you'll have to choose whether you want to upscale in order to enable that. All right, so again, looking through those benchmarks and looking at the price differences of, at this exact moment in time, the 4060 costs about 16% more, comparing the lowest price that was recently available on the 7600. It's about a 20% price difference. What do we think? So if we scroll back through the benchmark results super quickly, kind of looking down here, is the 4060 usually justifying that? Well, a lot of times it is less than 20% of a lead. However, when ray tracing is enabled, it frequently is more than a 20% lead. And it often is ahead, even if it's not by 16 or 20%, right? Again, depending on the exact settings. So, but there are definitely games where they perform about the same. We saw that in Plague Tale. But then there's other games where it seems to me, and this was interesting, that despite these both being 8GB GPUs, it seems like the AMD GPU trips up on that more than the 4060 does. At least that's my suspicion. It seems like it's having a bit more spillover into system RAM and the overall performance falling a bit further behind, despite them both being 8GB cards, so perhaps there is some more efficiency to the memory handling. Because again, in the same game, when we drop down to the high settings, which does bring the VRAM situation under an 8GB limit, it's more designed to fit for 8GB cards, we then still saw the 4060 ahead, but by a smaller margin. So this seemed to be a good game for the 4060 either way, relatively. But it did point to perhaps some better VRAM handling, which was interesting. Anyway, and like I said, though, in a lot of games, these GPUs are not significantly far apart. A lot of times it's a single-digit difference, although again, with ray tracing enabled and heavy VRAM usage, it seems to be a little more skewed in the 4060's favor. Saw some things again where the 1% lows seemed to recover better when they were spilling over their VRAM capacity on the 4060, which was kind of interesting. So overall, but I mean, we definitely got some wins for the 7600 with Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, all of that. Even a little bit ahead in Cyberpunk at 1080p and even a little bit more at 1440p and with upscaling. So the 7600 certainly got its wins, and I have a feeling how far ahead on average either of these GPUs is going to depend a lot on the specific set of games that you happen to select. I focus on the latest games that have released because I think that's going to be the most indicative of what future games coming out will be like, rather than benchmarking, 5-year-old games or whatever. So in the ones that I focused on here, it certainly seems like more often than not, the 4060 is a bit ahead. I also do think that DLSS upscaling does look better than FSR upscaling. And having frame generation is a nice to have, but situationally useful feature because it adds latency and it's not available in every game. You're not going to use it in competitive games. You're not going to have it in every game. And even if you have it, because it adds latency, you're going to want a high base frame rate, and that also helps with the image quality a bit. So it is nice to have, though, and AMD still does not have their FSR 3 competitor out for that yet, and still no word on an official release date on it. It's been a while now, hoping we get an update on that. So overall, I mean, if these GPUs were priced the same, they're both 8GB, the 4060 seems to be ahead more often than not in my testing, although the 7600 certainly did get its wins and its ties. The 4060 certainly seems to be the better GPU. I don't think the average results, especially when you're not including, if you're not including ray tracing, I don't think the average results were 20% ahead, but 16%, 10% ahead might be a little more common. 16% wasn't unheard of, but again, the 7600 got its wins too. But again, you can look at more things like the energy efficiency. We're seeing a lot of times 160 watts or more on the 7600 versus, I think I need to scroll down a little bit on my, it's taking up too much space here. Around 104, there it is, 114 watts or so on my 4060. I do like the 4060 more than I like the 7600, and I think a 20% price gap on them does actually, I think, make sense. I think the problem is that both of these GPUs should come down. I think the 7600 should cost less than the 4060. But I think the 4060 should be closer to the $250 mark. And that means that the 7600 should come down lower than that, in my opinion, to be exciting. Again, the 7600 is offering similar performance and features to the previous generation 6650 XT, which has been available for a long time at lower prices than this. Like 6650 XT right now is not much lower than a 7600. Looks like I could get one for $230 right now. The 6600 XT is also very similar. The XT version is $220. So again, I'm not blown away by the value of the 7600 at $250, so I would like both of these GPUs to come down. And again, if you are going to be buying in the $300 price range, like the 4060, like I said, I think if you haven't yet, you should take a look at my video comparing the 3060, 4060, and 6700 XT, which is a 12 gigabyte card and was frequently significantly ahead of the 4060, especially in games that spill over the VRAM capacity significantly and at 1440p and things like that. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of my overall thought here is, okay, I think the 4060 can maybe justify its price increase over the 7600, but it can't justify its own price. So I think that means that both of these GPUs need to come down. That's my final conclusion. If you want to buy them, okay. But like I said, if you're buying in the $300 range, I think the 6700 XT makes more sense. Unfortunately, when you get down to around $250, it's hard to find anything that's a lot more exciting than a 7600. It's just the fact that the 7600 is not that much better than a 6650 XT or a 6600 XT, which is available for less. You do get the AV1 encoder on the new generation GPU, I guess. And if you really need to save a budget, you know, you got your 6600 hanging out at 180. It would be cool if we could see the 7600 get down to this price point someday. You know, I guess we'll just need to wait for that. I don't know. I'm not saying it needs to get this low right now, but just maybe we can hope. All right, guys. I don't know what else you guys want to see. If you want to see anything else on the 4060, I am interested in comparing it against my Arc GPUs, although that didn't get a whole lot of votes on my community poll. You guys could let me know if there is other ones that you want to see. I'm going to be pretty busy around the 4th of July with family coming into town, so if you're watching this video on the day it launched, probably no big head-to-head comparisons coming out in the next day or two, but maybe a little bit further on. But also, I did benchmark a lot of other GPUs for this testing. So maybe there's some other comparisons that would be interesting, even if they don't necessarily involve the 4060. Like maybe another look at the $200, $250 GPUs, including like the Arc A750 in there on the latest drivers and things like that. Who knows? Let me know what you guys are interested in seeing. Hopefully you found this video useful and interesting, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.